The kitchen at the edge of Station 17 smelled like failure and overcooked dreams. Ryan Foster, the only human chef in a galaxy that had moved beyond primitive heat application, wiped down counters no one important would ever notice. But every night, a small alien girl pressed her luminescent face against his window, her expression twisted in disgust. She was the daughter of the most powerful ambassador in 9 systems, and she hated everything he stood for, until the night he served her a pot roast that tasted like a memory she didn't know she had. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The kitchen exhaled steam like a tired animal at the end of its shift. Ryan Foster stood at the industrial range, shoulders bent under fluorescent lights that buzzed with the frequency of insects long extinct on Earth. His apron, once white, now bore the brown and amber stains of 1,000 meals no one had thanked him for. The pot before him simmered with the patience of something that understood time differently than the galaxy around it. Beef, carrots, onions, celery, the same recipe his wife had taught him before the accident, before he became a single father to a memory and a set of worn cookbooks. Station 17 orbited nothing in particular, a waypoint between systems where travelers paused but never stayed. The diner occupied a corner berth in the commercial district, wedged between a molecular cuisine pavilion that served deconstructed nutrients and a Vayari restaurant where food arrived as vapor and reformed on the tongue. Ryan's establishment, which he had optimistically named The Hearth, attracted the desperate and the nostalgic, mostly the desperate. Through the window, the station's main concourse glittered with bioluminescent beings, Threxians in their dark armor, Palarin delegates with skin like polished coral, Vayari youth, whose patterns shifted with their moods. They walked past his window the way water flows around a stone. Occasionally one would glance in, note the primitive cooking methods, the actual fire beneath actual metal, and move on with something between pity and revulsion. But one face returned every night, small, no taller than a human child of 8 or 9 years, though Ryan had learned that age meant nothing when measuring alien development. Her skin held the pale green luminescence of deep-sea creatures, her eyes too large and too knowing. She wore the formal robes of the Diplomatic Youth Corps, deep purple threaded with silver that caught the station's artificial starlight. And every night she watched him cook with an expression of pure, clinical disgust. Ryan had named her the critic in his mind, though he had never spoken to her. She would stand at the window for exactly 12 minutes, her small hands pressed against the glass, her face a study in revulsion as he basted, stirred, and plated. Sometimes other young aliens joined her, pointing and laughing at the human who still believed in pots and pans. But she never laughed. She studied him the way a scientist studies a specimen of an inferior species, cataloging his failures with the dispassion of someone who had already reached her conclusions. Tonight, as Ryan pulled the pot roast from the oven, the meat falling apart at the mere suggestion of a fork, he glanced up. She stood there as always. Her luminescent face pressed close to the glass. Their eyes met for just a moment. Hers narrowed with something sharper than disgust. Contempt, perhaps, or challenge. Ryan held her gaze, then looked back down at his pot roast. He had learned long ago that dignity lived in the work itself, not in the eyes that watched it. The meat steamed, the vegetables glistened with their own juices. And somewhere in that simple chemistry, something older than starships whispered that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. The girl turned and walked away, her robes trailing behind her like a judgment rendered and sealed. The summons arrived at dawn, if dawn meant anything on a station where light followed schedules instead of stars. Ryan stood in his cramped quarters, reading the message for the 3rd time, certain he had misunderstood. The Culinary Council of the Intergalactic Youth Summit requested his presence, not requested, summoned. He arrived at the administrative tower an hour later, his chef's whites pressed as well as recycled fabric, aloud. The waiting room hummed with the anxious energy of beings who had been kept waiting longer than their status permitted. Molecular gastronomists in their pristine lab coats, vapor cuisine specialists with their crystalline instruments, chefs whose restaurants required reservations made in increments of light years. Coordinator Brex called him last, as if saving the least significant for when attention had already wandered elsewhere. The coordinator's office floated 3 levels above the station floor, its walls transparent, offering a view of the commerce district below. Brex himself was Threxian, his carapace the deep obsidian of bureaucratic authority, his mandibles clicking with impatience before Ryan had even sat down. "The Nexus Prime chef canceled," Brex said without preamble. "Philosophical differences with the menu parameters. We need a replacement." Ryan waited, confused about why this information had been delivered to him. "You're the replacement," Brex clarified, his tone suggesting he found the situation as distasteful as Ryan did surprising. "I run a diner," Ryan said carefully. "I cook pot roast and mashed potatoes. The Youth Summit requires food, and we are contractually obligated to provide it. Every other establishment on this station has either declined or is already committed." Brex's mandibles twitched. "You are, by process of elimination, our solution." The word solution carried the weight of an insult. "The delegates are children," Ryan said, though he knew even as he spoke that the term meant nothing in a gathering of species who matured at different rates and measured age in different currencies. "The delegates represent the future leadership of 9 systems. They are scholars, advocates, and in some cases, royalty." Brex leaned forward, his compound eyes catching the light. "They expect cuisine that reflects the sophistication of their education. They have been trained in molecular composition, nutrient optimization, and aesthetic presentation theory. And you want me to serve them pot roast. I want you to serve them something they will tolerate long enough for us to fulfill our contractual obligations without incident." Brex slid a tablet across his desk. "The lead delegate is Vera, daughter of Ambassador Theris of the Polarian Accord. She chairs the Cultural Committee and has final approval on all culinary decisions." Ryan's chest tightened. He knew that name. He knew that face. The girl at his window every night, the one who watched him with contempt. "She's already expressed her opinions about traditional Earth cooking methods," Brex continued, oblivious to Ryan's recognition. "Quite colorfully, in fact, called it decomposed matter, wrapped in shame, during last cycle's symposium." Ryan looked at the tablet, at the formal portrait of Vera in her diplomatic robes, her luminescent face, arranged in an expression of appropriate seriousness, the same face that had judged him through glass. "When do I start?" he asked. The preparation kitchen assigned to Ryan sat in the station's lower commercial ring, a space designed for efficiency rather than inspiration. Steel surfaces reflected harsh lighting, and the ventilation system wheezed with the effort of processing 9 different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. Ryan had spent 3 days preparing, testing recipes against the nutritional parameters Brex had provided, adjusting temperatures and cooking times for ingredients that had traveled light years in suspension. The pot roast sat in its braising pan, the meat falling tender after 6 hours of slow heat. Carrots and potatoes surrounded it, their edges caramelized, their centers soft. Onions had dissolved into the rich gravy, their sweetness balancing the savory depth of beef stock and red wine. It was the same recipe his wife had perfected over years of Sunday dinners, the one that had filled their small apartment with warmth and the promise of family. The tasting room adjoined the kitchen, separated by a glass partition that allowed observers to watch without interference. 20 young delegates filled the tiered seating, their varied forms creating a rainbow of skin tones, carapaces, and bioluminescent patterns. At the center table sat Vera, her small frame draped in formal robes, her luminescent skin casting a pale green glow across the white tablecloth. Coordinator Breck stood beside her, his mandibles clicking nervously. Station Manager Kane observed from the upper tier, his human face carefully neutral. Dr. Hallis, the summit's molecular cuisine consultant, sat with arms crossed, her Veyari patterns shifting with what Ryan had learned to recognize as skepticism. Ryan carried the platter through the partition door, the weight of it familiar in his hands. He set it before Vera with the same quiet care he used when serving anyone, human or alien, important or invisible. The meat steamed, releasing aromas that seemed almost defiant in their simplicity. Vera stared at the dish as if it had personally offended her. She lifted a utensil, one adapted for her three-fingered grip, and prodded the meat with clinical precision. It fell apart at the touch, revealing the pink center that spoke of proper temperature and patient timing. "Primitive thermal application," she said, her voice carrying the clear tones of someone educated in multiple languages. "No molecular restructuring, no nutrient optimization, no consideration for aesthetic coherence." The other delegates leaned forward, some giggling, others recording on devices that hovered like interested insects. Vera lifted a piece of meat to her mouth, her expression already arranged in judgment. She chewed slowly, analytically, as if cataloging every failure in real time. "This is decomposed matter," she announced, setting down her utensil with finality. "Flesh subjected to crude heat until its cellular structure collapses. The vegetables have been similarly destroyed. There is no artistry here, no understanding of modern culinary science. This is food, as our ancestors might have prepared it before we evolved beyond such barbarism." The room erupted in agreement, young voices layering mockery upon mockery. Coordinator Brex turned to Ryan, his mandibles tight. "Chef Foster, I believe we need to reconsider this arrangement." Ryan stood silent, watching Vera's luminescent face glow with triumph, and said nothing at all. Ryan returned to his diner after midnight, when the station's artificial cycle dimmed to simulate the night that space never truly offered. The humiliation sat in his chest like undigested stone. Vera's words echoed with the precision of a knife finding exactly where to cut. Decomposed matter wrapped in shame. The other delegates had laughed, their various forms of amusement creating a chorus of mockery that followed him through the corridors. He unlocked the storage room behind his kitchen, a space barely large enough to turn around in, lined with metal shelving that held supplies ordered in bulk to save credits he never seemed to have. But at the back, behind crates of dried pasta and industrial cans of tomato sauce, sat something he had built from salvaged parts and stubborn hope. The growing chamber hummed softly, its artificial sunlight casting a warm glow across rows of vegetables that had no business thriving in the sterile environment of a space station. Carrots with their feathered tops still attached. Potatoes with skin that still held the memory of actual soil. Turnips, parsnips, beets, all the root vegetables his wife had grown in their garden back on Earth before the transport accident that had taken her and left him holding seed packets and grief. He had smuggled soil from Earth in violation of agricultural transport laws, mixing it with the station's recycled organic matter to create something approximating the loam she had worked with her bare hands. The chamber maintained humidity, temperature, and light cycles that mimicked seasons no longer relevant to his life. Every day he tended these plants with the same patience he brought to his cooking, the same quiet attention that Vera had dismissed as primitive. Ryan knelt beside the carrot bed, pulling one from the soil. It came free with the resistance of something that had taken root and grown despite the artificiality of its surroundings. The earth clinging to its orange skin smelled like memory, like Sunday afternoons when his wife would call him to the garden to see what had flourished. He sat on the floor, his back against the cold metal shelving, and turned the carrot in his hands. The tasting had been designed to humiliate him, to confirm what everyone on the station already believed, that human cooking belonged to a past the galaxy had evolved beyond. But sitting here among the vegetables that refused to acknowledge their own impossibility, Ryan felt something shift in his understanding. Vera had analyzed his pot roast with scientific precision, cataloging its molecular structure, its nutritional composition, its thermal properties. But she had never asked why it tasted the way it did. She had never considered that the slow breakdown of cellular structures might create something more complex than what had existed before. That patience might be a technology more sophisticated than speed. Ryan stood, brushing soil from his hands. The carrots needed another week. The beets were nearly ready. And somewhere in the chemistry of root vegetables grown in impossible soil, in the alchemy of braising that transformed simple ingredients into something that spoke of home and care and time, Ryan began to see a pattern that Vera's education had never taught her to recognize. He would serve her again, but this time he would cook for what she had forgotten, not for what she thought she knew. The second tasting arrived with less ceremony than the first. Coordinator Brex had made it clear this was Ryan's final opportunity, delivered with the tone of someone granting a mercy he did not believe was deserved. The same delegates filled the tiered seating, their anticipation sharpened by the memory of the previous humiliation. Vera sat at the center table, her luminescent skin glowing with the quiet confidence of someone who had already won. Ryan entered carrying a Dutch oven, its cast-iron surface darkened by years of use. He set it on the table. Without flourish, without the presentation theater that molecular cuisine demanded, the lid came off with a whisper of steam, revealing meat that had been braised for 8 hours in a liquid that smelled of earth and time. But this was not the pot roast from before. The beef had been cut differently, into smaller pieces that allowed the braising liquid to penetrate more completely. And surrounding the meat, arranged with the precision Vera claimed he lacked, were root vegetables from his hidden garden. Carrots, still wearing traces of actual soil, parsnips that had never seen a hydroponic tank, beets that stained the braising liquid with their deep purple truth. The aroma that rose from the pot carried notes that did not exist in synthesized ingredients, the mineral complexity of vegetables that had grown in real earth, the caramelized sugars from the slow reduction of cooking liquid over patient hours, the subtle bitterness of parsnips balancing the sweetness of carrots, the earthiness of beets grounding everything in something older than starships. Vera's expression remained carefully neutral, but Ryan noticed the slight widening of her too large eyes. She lifted her utensil with the same clinical precision as before, selecting a piece of meat and a cross-section of carrot. The delegates leaned forward, devices hovering to record the moment of dismissal they anticipated. She placed the food in her mouth, and for the first time since Ryan had watched her through his diner window, her expression faltered. Not with disgust, with something that looked almost like confusion. She chewed slowly, her luminescent skin flickering in a pattern Ryan had never seen before, pulses of light that seemed to move without conscious control. "The mineral composition," she said quietly, speaking more to herself than to the room. "The substrate indicates actual terrestrial growth medium. The thermal breakdown has created compound chains that mirror." She stopped, her eyes focusing somewhere beyond the present moment. Her three-fingered hand trembled slightly as she set down her utensil. "This tastes like the old songs," Vera whispered, and for the first time since Ryan had known of her existence, she sounded like what she was, a child far from home, educated beyond her years, trained to dismiss what her body remembered. The other delegates stirred with uncertainty. Dr. Hallis leaned forward, her Veyari pattern shifting with interest rather than skepticism. Vera looked up at Ryan, her luminescent face no longer arranged in judgment. "How did you do this?" she asked. "How did a human recreate what my own people have forgotten?" Ryan met her gaze with the same quiet dignity he had maintained through her mockery. "I never forgot," he said. "I just kept cooking." The tasting room emptied slowly, delegates filing out with uncertain murmurs that lacked the sharp edges of mockery. Dr. Hallis paused at the door, her Veyari patterns rippling with questions she did not yet know how to ask. Coordinator Breck stood frozen in bureaucratic confusion, his mandibles clicking without producing sound. But Vera remained seated, her small hands gripping the edge of the table as if the room had begun to tilt. Ryan had begun clearing the dishes when she spoke, her voice smaller than he had ever heard it. "My grandmother sang songs about food like this," Vara said, her luminescent skin pulsing with rhythms that seemed beyond her control. "Before the Reformation, before we decided that efficiency was more important than memory." Ryan set down the Dutch oven and pulled a chair across from her. He sat without asking permission, the way one sits with someone who has just discovered a wound they did not know they carried. "The Polarian Reformation happened 3 generations ago," Vara continued, speaking as if to herself. "We abandoned agricultural practices. We moved to molecular synthesis. We called it evolution." Her eyes met his, and for the first time they held something other than contempt. "But my grandmother would hold me when I was very small, before my mother sent me to the diplomatic academy, and she would sing about food that grew in dark soil, that required patience, that tasted like the ground itself was speaking." She reached for the remaining piece of beet on her plate, its purple flesh staining her fingers. "I thought they were just songs, metaphors for a primitive past we had transcended." She placed the beet in her mouth, and her eyes closed. A single tear tracked down her luminescent cheek, glowing faintly in the artificial light. But this is what she was singing about, this exact thing, the weight of it, the way it makes you feel connected to something older than language. Ryan watched her process the connection between body and memory, between dismissal and recognition. He had seen this before, in his own mirror, the first time he had cooked his wife's recipe after she died, when he realized that food could be a bridge between what was lost and what remained. "Your people didn't forget how to cook like this," Ryan said quietly. "They chose to forget. There's a difference." Vera opened her eyes, the tears still flowing. "Why would we choose to forget something that feels like this?" "Because remembering hurts," Ryan answered. "Because when food connects you to the past, you have to acknowledge what you've lost. It's easier to call it primitive than to admit you miss it." Vera stared at the empty pot, at the traces of braising liquid that remained, at the evidence of hours of patient work that her education had trained her to dismiss. "Teach me," she said, and it was not a command from a diplomat's daughter. It was a request from a child who had just discovered she was homesick for a home she had never known. "Please, teach me how to cook like this." The arrangement began the following day cycle, negotiated through Coordinator Brex with the reluctant acceptance of someone who no longer trusted his own judgment. Vara would spend 2 hours each afternoon in Ryan's kitchen, studying what she insisted on calling traditional thermal food preparation techniques to maintain the appearance of academic research. Ryan suspected she needed the formal language to justify what felt dangerously like vulnerability. She arrived in simpler robes than the diplomatic uniform, their deep blue unmarked by the silver threading of rank. Her hands, he noticed, had been scrubbed clean, prepared for work rather than observation. She stood at the edge of his kitchen like someone approaching the border of a country they had been taught to fear. "We'll start with something simple," Ryan said, setting out carrots from his hidden garden, their tops still feathered with green. "Braising works because you're patient. You let heat do its work slowly, breaking down what's tough into something tender." Vera picked up a carrot, turning it in her 3-fingered grip. "In molecular cuisine, we deconstruct the carrot into its component nutrients and rebuild it in optimized form. Faster, more efficient." "But does it taste like a carrot?" Ryan asked. She paused, the question catching her unprepared. "It tastes like the ideal of a carrot, the pure essence, without imperfection. Without memory," Ryan added quietly. He showed her how to peel, the blade moving in steady strokes that removed skin without wasting flesh. "Cooking like this isn't about perfection, it's about transformation. You take something raw and make it into something that feeds more than just your body. She worked in silence, her movements precise but uncertain, the way someone moves when learning a language their mouth doesn't quite remember how to shape. Ryan prepared the braising pot, browning meat in oil that snapped and sang, the Maillard reaction creating compounds that existed nowhere in nature except in the presence of heat and time. "My mother died when I was 6, Vera said suddenly, her voice barely above the sound of sizzling. "In your years, not mine. A diplomatic accident, a shuttle malfunction." She kept peeling, not looking at him. "My father raised me alone after that, sent me to the best academies, made sure I wanted for nothing." Ryan added the carrots to the pot, their raw brightness soon to be transformed by the slow alchemy of braising. "Except he never cooked," Vera continued. "We ate at state functions, at molecular pavilions, at places where food arrived as vapor or geometry." She set down her knife, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't remember what her cooking tasted like. I was too young. But when I tasted your pot roast, my body remembered something my mind couldn't name." Ryan covered the pot, setting the temperature low, committing them both to hours of patient waiting. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the only way to remember what we've lost is to cook it back into existence." Vera nodded, her luminescent skin pulsing with a rhythm that looked almost like gratitude. Ambassador Theris arrived, unannounced, which Ryan had learned was the diplomatic equivalent of a declaration of war. The kitchen door opened with the pressurized hiss of someone accustomed to doors opening before they reached them, and suddenly the small space contracted around a presence that commanded rooms designed for thousands. She was tall in the way Vera would someday be tall, her luminescent skin a deeper green that spoke of age and authority. Her robes flowed like liquid midnight, threaded with platinum that caught light and held it hostage. Her eyes, the same too large shape as her daughter's, swept the kitchen with the precision of someone cataloging violations. Vera stood at the prep counter, her hands dusted with flour, a smear of braising liquid on her cheek. The pot on the stove simmered with the day's lesson, root vegetables surrendering their structure to become something more than themselves. She froze at her mother's entrance, her expression cycling through surprise, fear, and something that looked dangerously close to defiance. "Ambassador," Ryan said, setting down his knife with careful deliberation, "I wasn't expecting—" "Clearly," Theris interrupted, her voice carrying the modulated authority of someone who spoke and expected the universe to rearrange itself accordingly. "I received a report that my daughter has been spending unsupervised time with kitchen staff. I assumed there had been an error in the filing." "Mother," Vera began, but Theris raised a hand. "You are the chair of the Youth Summit's Cultural Committee. You have responsibilities that do not include whatever this is." She gestured at the kitchen with distaste. "Playing at being a cook while actual diplomatic work goes unattended." Vera's skin flickered with patterns Ryan had learned meant emotional distress. But when she spoke, her voice held steady. "I'm learning about traditional Polarian food preparation, before the Reformation, before we decided efficiency was more important than—" "Than what? Than our evolution beyond primitive sustenance methods?" Theris moved closer, her height casting Vera in shadow. "Your grandmother filled your head with songs about dirt and manual labor. I had hoped the Academy would educate that sentimentality out of you." "Grandmother's songs were about remembering," Vera said, her voice rising. "About staying connected to a past we outgrew for good reason," Theris snapped. Then she noticed the tears beginning to track down Vera's luminescent cheeks, and something in her expression shifted, not softening but becoming uncertain, as if she had discovered unexpected terrain. Vera turned back to the pot, her shoulders shaking. She lifted the lid and steam rose, carrying the scent of braised vegetables and slow-cooked meat, the aroma of patience and care, of time given freely to transformation. And then she began to cry in earnest, her small frame racked with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the present moment. She taught me oh, Vera whispered through her tears, about food that tasted like love, and I can't remember her face anymore, but this tastes exactly like her song said it would. Ambassador Theris stood very still, watching her daughter weep over a pot of braised vegetables. The Youth Summit's final assembly filled the grand hall with representatives from 9 systems, their varied forms creating a tapestry of scales, bioluminescence, and ceremonial armor. The gallery held ambassadors and dignitaries who had come to witness the future leadership present their cultural findings. Ambassador Theris sat in the front tier, her expression unreadable, her platinum-threaded robes arranged with diplomatic precision. Ryan stood at the back of the hall, uncomfortable in formal clothes borrowed from station manager Kane. He had not expected an invitation to what Vera had described only as my presentation. But Coordinator Brex had insisted his presence was required, though he would not explain why. Vera took the central platform, smaller than most of the delegates surrounding her, but commanding the space with the quiet authority she had developed over weeks of learning patience. Behind her, holographic displays awaited activation. Before her, the assembly watched with the polite attention granted to closing ceremonies. We have spent this summit analyzing cultural evolution, Vera began, her voice carrying through the hall's acoustics. We have celebrated our technological advancement, our molecular cuisine, our efficiency. She paused, her luminescent skin pulsing with controlled rhythm. But I want to talk about what we lost when we decided to call our past primitive. The assembly stirred. Several delegates exchanged glances. Dr. Hallis leaned forward, her Veyari patterns brightening with interest. Vera activated the display, and images filled the space above her. Not of gleaming laboratories or molecular pavilions, but of Ryan's kitchen, his hands working dough, steam rising from braising pots, root vegetables still wearing traces of soil, the simple, patient acts of cooking that required nothing but time and care. "This is Chef Ryan Foster," Vera said, and Ryan felt every eye in the hall turn toward him. A human who cooks the way our ancestors cooked before we evolved beyond needing such methods. I spent the first tasting session mocking him, calling his food decomposed matter, primitive thermal application. Laughter rippled through some delegates, quickly silenced by others. But then he served me something that my body recognized, even though my education told me to dismiss it. Vera's voice softened, becoming less diplomatic and more honest. He served me memory, connection, the taste of songs my grandmother sang before she died, before I forgot what her face looked like. The hall had gone completely silent. Molecular cuisine gives us optimal nutrition, Vera continued. But it cannot give us what this human's cooking gave me, the feeling of being connected to something older than starships. The understanding that food can carry memory across generations. The simple truth that some things become more, not less, when we let them transform slowly. She looked directly at her mother, her luminescent skin glowing with something between defiance and hope. "We did not evolve beyond this," Vera said. "We simply stopped practicing it, and in doing so, we lost the ability to taste where we came from." Ambassador Theris sat motionless, her expression no longer unreadable, but raw with recognition she could not hide. The observation deck had been empty for years, a forgotten space on Station 17's upper level where transparent walls offered views of stars that never changed their distance. The station's administrators had sealed it after budget cuts eliminated the maintenance staff, leaving it to gather dust and the particular loneliness of places built for wonder, but abandoned to efficiency. Ryan stood at its center now, 6 months after the summit, watching Vera direct a group of young aliens in the proper depth for planting carrot seeds. She had traded her diplomatic robes for something more practical, though she still wore the silver threading that marked her station. Her hands, once unfamiliar with work, now moved with the confidence of someone who understood that patience was its own kind of power. "Not too deep," she instructed a young Threxian, whose armor made delicate work difficult. The seeds need to feel the weight of soil, but not be buried by it. The observation deck had been transformed. Grow beds lined the walls, filled with soil that Ryan and Vera had mixed from station compost and carefully hoarded earth samples. Artificial sunlight cycled through seasons, and humidity controls created an atmosphere that felt almost like breathing real air. Carrots, potatoes, turnips, beets, all the root vegetables that required patient waiting, grew in rows that curved to follow the deck's circular shape. Ambassador Theris visited twice a week, officially to monitor her daughter's academic project, but Ryan had noticed she stayed longer each time, her questions about growing cycles becoming more personal, less diplomatic. Last week she had asked if he remembered the song Vera's grandmother used to sing, the one about food that tasted like soil and starlight. The program had grown beyond anything Ryan had imagined that night when Vera first asked him to teach her. 20 young delegates from 5 different species now rotated through the garden, learning not just to cook but to grow, to wait, to understand that transformation could not be rushed. Dr. Hallis had published 3 papers on the psychological benefits of temporal investment in food preparation, using language that made patients sound scientific. Coordinator Brex had stopped by yesterday, his mandibles clicking with what Ryan had learned to recognize as approval. The Culinary Council wanted to expand the program to other stations, to create gardens where species could remember what they had decided to forget. But the real victory happened in smaller moments. Like now, watching Vera kneel beside a Vayari child who could not understand why the carrots had not grown overnight, explaining with the gentle authority of someone who had learned the lesson herself that some things only become what they are meant to be if you give them time. Ryan's diner still operated below, still served pot roast to whoever wandered in. But now, when he looked out his window, he sometimes saw young aliens pressing their faces to the glass, not with disgust but with curiosity, with hunger for something their education had not taught them to name. Above them, in a garden that defied the efficiency of space, vegetables grew in impossible soil, tended by hands from different worlds, learning the same patient truth. That memory lives in taste. That connection requires time. And that sometimes the most sophisticated thing you can do is slow down long enough to let something transform into exactly what it was always meant to become.